First, let me welcome you. I'm Ross Sandler, professor of law here at the New York Law School and director of the Center for New York City Law, and I really welcome you all on this extremely cold day. We're very honored to have Steve Banks here, but first let me introduce the president and dean of New York Law School, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross. Just wanted to welcome everyone very briefly this morning. You know, it's a very cold day, and certainly at New York Law School, it's always a warm welcome and atmosphere here. So thank you for being here, a packed room, for a very special guest, our dear friend and honorary degree recipient from 2014, Commissioner Stephen Banks. Steve is undoubtedly one of the most influential public interest lawyers of our time, and certainly someone who has taken on a Herculean task in city government and has much resting on his shoulders. It can't be understated the importance of his role. One of the toughest jobs in social services anywhere in this country, anywhere in the world. And being here on a morning like this reminds us of how important your job is and how critical the mission is and how much support you need as a public servant from all of us in delivering on that mission. And as I have said at this podium before, it's not often spoken to public servants while in service, but thank you. Everyone deserves a great deal of thanks in these jobs, which sometimes can feel daunting at best. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Ross, and we're really happy you're all here, and we look forward to the commissioner's talk this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Dean Crowell. Steve Banks is well known to all of us in the legal community. 31 years at Legal Aid, rising from the junior attorney all the way to the attorney in charge. And in that capacity, led an enormous organization, incredibly important to the city, 1,100 lawyers, an enormous law firm, led it through a period when it was close to bankruptcy, and he and the board gathered their resources and saved the institution from bankruptcy and let it regain enormous amount of strength. He has now taken on this position as commissioner, and I thought that I would look back in my files, and I pulled out the original Callahan decree, 1981, and what's interesting about it is the defendants are Hugh Carey. Some of you may not remember Hugh Carey. Barbara Bloom, who was commissioner of the New York State Department of Social Services, Ed Koch, the mayor, and Jack Proskoff. Where's Jack? Jack was a defendant in the case. Calvin Reed was director of shelter care. David Dinkins said he was going to be here. I guess he hasn't arrived yet, but I was thinking that there are at least 3 people who've been defendants in this case, Jack, Steve now, and David Dinkins. I make the point that these cases are really interesting in that the defendants are not bad people. They're the ones who are actually trying to solve the problems. And the case is now, 31 years old, the consent decree, and the problems still exist, which suggests just how difficult this issue is to bring to a conclusion. The other thing I'd like to share with the Callahan decree is how simple it was in 1981 to think that they were going to do it. This is what was required. Each resident shall have a bed minimum of 30 inches in width, substantially constructed in good repair and equipped with clean springs. Each bed will have clean, comfortable, well-constructed mattress. Each resident shall have 2 clean sheets and blankets and so forth. Each resident shall receive a locked storage unit. Laundry services shall be available. A staff attendant to resident ratio of at least 2% shall be maintained. A staff attendant trained in first aid should be there. A minimum of 10 hours per week of group recreation. They should be able to leave and return to the shelter at reasonable hours. They shall have, transportation shall be provided. They should have mail services. And there should be a good faith effort to have a pay telephone in every shelter. Now, I read this and I think about how simple it seemed at the time. I remember Stan Brezhnev speaking about this, and he said, At the time we signed this, we thought that it was just wrong to have people on the street. We should provide shelter. What we didn't understand is when we had them in the shelter, we had them for everything: mental health, physical health, and you notice only first aid is mentioned here. And today, you think about what the shelter has to provide, what it means to provide shelter for 60,000 people, and you begin to understand just what a mission, a journey, the city began when it signed this Callahan Decree in 1981. So today we're honored to have Steve Banks, one of the good guys, who was on both sides. He went from being the attorney to the defendant in the caption. And on both sides, he's worked so hard to bring the kind of care and shelter that people need. And we are honored to have him here today to speak on that topic. Steve?
Probably just sit down after those introductions, right? I said to someone I was very honored to be given an honorary degree from New York Law School. I went to a different law school that has some of that name in it. And I got to make a lot of jokes in that speech because it's great. People graduate from law school. You want to give people that mission of going forward. This is a much more serious topic. And obviously, I come to it from the following perspective. Providing services to the most vulnerable New Yorkers comes against a background of how do you reform institutions that provide those services. And I think, as Ross indicated, I'm honored to be the commissioner of the Human Resources Administration, an agency that I sued for more than 30 years. And now also the commissioner of the Department of Homeless Services, which was founded a little bit later, and I sued that agency for about 20 years. But the background of all of this really comes to something Ross said, which is the problem of homelessness is one in which, if you look at the numbers, it tells the story. Homelessness in New York City has increased 115% between 1994 and 2014. In January 1994, there were about 24,000 men, women, and children in the city shelter system. In January 2002, there were about 31,000 men, women, and children in the city shelter system. And by January 2014, it was 51,000. So you can see the trajectory of the problem. And the drivers are very common sense. It's about income. It's about rents, it's about mental health, it's about economics. And when I was a, very young legal aid lawyer and began representing homeless people in this city, think of what the city was like when Hugh Carey was the governor. Think about what the city was like when Ed Koch was the mayor. Very different city, and you can see the trajectory of the problem developing. When I was a young legal aid lawyer, the Legal Aid Society's office in Chelsea was the largest legal aid office. It served the west side of Manhattan from 34th Street to the Battery, west of Broadway. There were so many low-income people there that it had to be the largest office of the Legal Aid Society. When I began to take cases myself at an early point in my career, many of my clients lived in Park Slope, not so far from where I live. And so if you look at the progress of the city and you look at the growth of this problem, it's a stark reality. How do you go about making change? So as Ross said, I got a battlefield promotion and became head of the Legal Aid Society when we were about a half a second away from going bankrupt. And we had about $80,000 in the bank. It's a $220 million agency when I left it, 1,100 lawyers. Someone asked me what prepared me for the job I now have managing 1,100 lawyers. You can laugh, it's a law school setting. Think about managing 1,100 lawyers. My old colleague Danny Greenberg always said that you hire them to question authority, and at the Legal Aid Society you are authority. So you certainly understand what it's like to manage that kind of an organization. And we spent time reforming an agency that was very old and had ossified and needed reform. And one of the major pieces of reform was to engage the staff and to take a different perspective on how to deliver services, but also to look at the quality of delivery of services. So important reforms that happened then were realizing the promise of Gideon and getting a state law passed that capped the numbers of cases that criminal defense lawyers would handle. And similarly, getting a state law passed capping the number of cases that lawyers representing children in family court could handle. And similarly, working with the chief judge to provide additional dollars to expand legal services on the civil side to address the great gap that people with civil problems experience. So the effort to take one agency and reform it gave me a basis in which I was selected to become the commissioner of HRA. Now, how many here have had any interactions with HRA? That's an important institution in the city's fabric. Why? It serves 3 million of the most vulnerable New Yorkers, 3 million New Yorkers. It's got a staff of 14,000. When I came to HRA, it was a situation in which we had 20 years worth of one approach to policy. And for staff and for clients, we found a whole series of unnecessary transactions. And that caused problems for clients, caused problems for staff. So part of the reforms that we proceeded with at HRA was to address that problem of unnecessary transactions. Why are unnecessary transactions a problem? Because every interaction, every notice that's sent, every time something happens is an opportunity for someone to potentially lose benefits that they vitally need. And every interaction that a client has with our agency potentially takes away time from the important thing of looking for employment, working with us in the employment area. So it was fundamentally important for us to take a new approach for the delivery of services at HRA. So we've used technology. You can submit documents with your food stamp case now off your smartphone. 70% of our clients have smartphones nationally and in the city. And so taking away the requirement that the interaction is if you're going to a bakery and you just come in and you need to get services, to having clients interact with our agency the way all of you interact with the agencies that you interact with, your bank, Con Edison, other agencies, to be able to use a smartphone to submit documents takes away unnecessary transactions. To now give clients the ability to see what is going on with their cases, request a budget letter electronically, brings the kind of interactions that clients have into the same kinds of interactions that all of you have, and frees up staff time to deal with the 30% of clients that can't handle having a smartphone. So an approach to the delivery of services is really important for both staff and for clients. Overall, however, what is one of our most fundamental missions? One of our most fundamental missions is giving people a pathway off of public assistance. Reforming our employment services, therefore, were critical to enabling people to get off of public assistance. I have to acknowledge Mayor David Dinkins. I'm sure you'll have a question. You'll be given the first one. Employment service reform is so critical to giving clients a pathway off of public assistance. For many years, there were debates about how many people were on HRA's caseload and what did the caseload convey. What the caseload conveyed for many years was the process of churning, moving people on and off the caseload, that led to unnecessary fair hearings, that led to, when I first became the commissioner, the state taking the position that potentially the city would be fined $10 million for unnecessary fair hearings. This is the process in which someone receives a notice, is cut off of public benefits, takes a fair hearing challenge, wins the fair hearing, is put back on public benefits. So from a caseload point of view, the client is on in January, let's say, is off in February, challenging their benefits, and is back on in March. And so if you take a monthly view of what the HRA caseload is, it reflected historically that type of churning on and off. But if you looked at the annualized caseload, the unduplicated annual caseload for HRA, it's essentially flat. So an important reform that we had to make was to focus on delivering services instead of this churning process and to reform our employment services. We've done that. We've rebid all of the employment contracts, and at the beginning of 2017, we're going to be implementing a new employment services program. The WEP program will be phased out at the end of this month. Now, we didn't phase out WEP because we think that clients shouldn't be engaged in work activity. Federal and state law require work activity, but we do think that that work activity has to be aimed at encouraging people to move on a career pathway. And so the employment reforms at HRA are focused on that, moving people on to a career pathway as opposed to the process of turning people on and off the caseload. And we've been blessed with having terrific partners in the employment services world who are delivering new programs to us. Focusing on education and training is a critical component of moving our programs forward. So one of the early reforms was working to have a state law passed that enabled clients to be able to participate in educational activities as part of a pathway off the caseload and out of poverty. The data is pretty clear. If you don't have a high school equivalency or a degree, you're going to earn about $20,000. If you have some type of college, you're going to earn a lot more and move off of our caseload, but more importantly, move off of poverty. So restoring the ability to have education and training was important. And by the way, when we did that, we surveyed other states and what other states were doing. We found that states like Kentucky and other states around the country were doing many more innovative things than we were at HRA. And so we borrowed, I guess the term in this law school environment might be we stole, but we did borrow from other states to see what it was that we could do to improve our services here. Look, reforming 20 years of public assistance policies to improve them, to get better outcomes for clients, doesn't happen overnight. I became the HRA commissioner on April Fool's Day, 2014, and it has taken a period of time of extensive consultations with clients, focus groups with clients, focus groups with staff, working with providers to come up with a much better delivery system model, and we will be doing that during the coming year. But I emphasize the time and the care we took to it, because what we also found was one-size-fits-all approaches don't work in the delivery of social services. Our clients come with all kinds of pathways that led them to us, and the pathway to move forward is not linear for all of our clients. So on the social service side, the changes that we're making are really to ensure that we have individualized delivery of services to clients. About a year ago, this week, the mayor ordered a 90-day review of homeless services and asked me to conduct that review. I guess it had something to do with my experience being a plaintiff's lawyer for many years, litigating over these issues, but also because of a whole series of other reforms that we had made at HRA, which were aimed at homelessness prevention. For many years, HRA, after the founding of the Department of Homeless Services, had withdrawn from the important role that it historically should be playing in terms of preventing homelessness. So one of the first things, even before the 90-day review that we had done at HRA, was greatly expand the provision of legal services. This is music to the ears of any law school. Expansion of legal services. That means more lawyers. You can applaud in the back, the students, I know. So the mayor for many years as a council member had been a tremendous supporter of legal services. So it made tremendous sense to consolidate all of the patchwork programs that had existed in many agencies. As I look around the room, I work with many of you in past years, advocating, lobbying, call it what you want, to get additional dollars for legal services. and ultimately the mayor made the decision to consolidate all city programs at HRA as part of a new approach to preventing homelessness. And at the time in 2013, and what we inherited was a budget of about $6.5 million, slightly south of $6.5 million for legal services, predominantly to prevent evictions, but also some other dollars for immigration services and for helping people get disability benefits. But over the course of the last 2 years, funding for legal services to prevent evictions and to prevent harassment has increased tenfold. We now operate a program of $62 million in funding for legal services in New York City to prevent evictions and to prevent harassment. An additional approximately $20 million is for various immigration programs and disability assistance programs. But that fundamental change of providing additional dollars for legal services has had two important impacts. For years, all of us used to say, well, 99% of landlords had representation in housing court and 1% of tenants. As a result of a study that we did earlier this year, we found that with the additional funding, now 27% of tenants in housing court have lawyers as opposed to the prior 1%. And equally important, the programs that were funded aren't actually fully implemented. They will be fully implemented over the course of this year. The implementation required legal services providers to build up additional infrastructure to be able to implement a 10-fold increase. And so we expect even further improvements in the numbers of tenants that are represented in court. But what's happened along the line when we did that? There's been a 24% reduction in Marshals evictions in New York City. At the same time, legal services have been expanded, and at the same time as HRA has provided additional rental assistance to prevent people from being evicted. And we also provided that additional rental assistance by improving the management of our program. When I came to HRA, we provided rent arrears checks all over the city at different places. And when I first came in, I spoke to judges, I spoke to landlords, I spoke to tenant representatives, and everybody said, you're too slow in paying. You have to come up with a better system. So instead of having a diffuse issuance of checks, we created a centralized rent processing unit, which has dramatically increased the time, or reduced the time period for paying rent arrears, as it increased our ability to prevent evictions. By the way, anytime you hear from housing court judges, landlords, and tenant advocates the same thing, pay attention. So we did, and that's why we made that particular change. So when I came into the 90-day review, we were very focused on reforms that were already happening at HRA to prevent homelessness, and obviously increasing prevention of homelessness is a key. But if you look back, what were the headlines a year ago? The headlines a year ago were conditions in shelters were criticized, were documented to be a problem, and in addition, there were issues around security in the shelters. So the two first reforms, even before the 90-day review proceeded very far, that we had to address was addressing conditions in shelters. So together with the providers, and I see many of you in this room, we created a shelter repair process, multi-agency inspections. We took a situation in which by the end of last January, there were 10,500 violations in the shelters that we wanted to stay in, and we reduced that down to about 2,000 violations now. That is a result of a massive effort to improve conditions in shelters and to address the problems. In terms of security, and I'm sure people will smile and think, well, he's a legal aid lawyer. That's interesting that a former legal aid lawyer is saying this. One of the things we needed to do to get control of security was to partner with the NYPD. And the NYPD has sent a management team to DHS and has dramatically improved our ability to provide security in our shelters. And that is a great improvement. Another thing that we did in addressing security, by the way, is we changed the way that we reported on security incidents and standardized the way that we record incidents of violence and other things in our shelter system. One of the things, by the way, that's important to understand is one of the key drivers of critical instances in our shelters relating to security is domestic violence. And so in family shelters, whether they're family shelters with children or family shelters with households without children, domestic violence is one of the major drivers. And so we've had to enhance programs for domestic violence in the family shelters. These were programs that had existed, that had been great programs, that were eliminated. We restored them and put them back into place. The other significant challenge we have in the shelters is that we're essentially running a de facto mental health system within the shelter system. And I think Ross referred to that earlier in terms of what the shelter system looks like. So we have 27 mental health shelters, which we should say that's an indication of tremendous progress to have such shelters. It's also an indication of the still unfulfilled promise of community-based mental health services for people who need them, and the shelter system has become the de facto provider of those services. Street homelessness on a day like today is certainly on everyone's mind. The Homestat program that the mayor announced about a year ago is another key area of reform that has been implemented. We doubled the number of outreach workers on the street, and we've also made it very clear that we're doing something that hasn't been tried before, which is we're creating a by-name list of individuals on the street to provide them with services. We're beginning to have success at bringing individuals off the streets, but like what we found at HRA, that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach. You can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to the streets, and simply looking at numbers, you have to look at the people behind those numbers. Each one of those individuals has a story that led them to the street. Again, not a linear route, and the route off takes repeated efforts to bring people in off the streets. We have repeated success stories. We have data to show that we're beginning to make progress in bringing people in off the streets. We'll have more to say about that shortly. But it was a tremendous investment by the mayor in additional outreach services and a brand new approach of taking a by-name list. We also have daily counting, and we have quarterly counting that we count not just to have numbers, but to help us deliver services. We want to make sure we know where people are. We want to make sure that we can have the impact that we need to have to bring people in off the streets. We have outreach in subways that's doubled. We have outreach on the streets that have doubled in all 5 boroughs. We're also increasing the numbers of safe haven beds and the numbers of drop-in centers. These are beds that are low demand, low threshold beds to help bring people in off the streets, and the drop-in centers in our away station where we have success in bringing people in and working with them directly to help that pathway off the street. Sometimes someone is not ready to come in to a shelter or a safe haven bed. They're only willing to come into a place indoors where they could get a shower, but that's an opportunity to intervene. We're going into hospital waiting rooms. We're going into libraries where homeless people are, where we hadn't provided services for in the past, and making one-on-one connections. We're going to solve this problem person by person, not by looking at large numbers. It requires an individualized approach. A further area that we reformed was rental assistance and shelter move-outs. The City of New York essentially ran a social experiment between 2011 and 2014, which was, could you run a shelter system with no rental assistance or housing aid to move people out of shelter? And we saw the results between 2011 and 2014 when the Advantage Rental Assistance Program was eliminated. At the time Advantage was eliminated, there were 37,000 people in the shelter system. It had increased from 2002 to 2011 to 37,000 from 31,000. But by 2014, that January, there were now 51,000 people in the shelter system. This is a growth of about 5,000 people a year when we ran a system without any rental assistance. And so one of the key things was to restore a system of rental assistance and housing aid to keep people from coming into shelter whenever possible and help people move out. And so as a result of these new programs over the last 2 years, nearly 50,000 men, women, and children have either avoided going into shelter or have been relocated from shelter to permanent housing. That is the reason why we do not have 68,000 men, women, and children in our shelter system today. That was the projection if we had kept on the course that we were at. We have in excess of 60,000. That's not a place that we want to be, but we have broken the trajectory of where we were headed. And now the continued programs that we're putting in place will bend the curve to get us to a place where we can make the kind of progress that we need to. But it's also important, and I know I'm running out of my time for overall comments because I promised plenty of time for questions. It's also important as we emerge from a national election to understand the national implications of this problem. If you look across the country, you see in major urban areas significant homelessness. San Francisco, Los Angeles, other cities, high rents, gap between income and rent. In New York City, 500,000 households who are renters fall into rent arrears in any given year. 3 out of 10 renters pay more than 50% of their income for rent. That's in our city. Those are the overhang facts that are significant factors in homelessness in our system. With our legal services programs, we've been able to bring down entry because of eviction down to about 11%. But 30% of the families coming into the shelter system are coming in with some history of domestic violence. About 10% qualify for domestic violence shelter, but it's almost a third of the families with children coming to the shelter system are coming as a result of domestic violence. So when you look at the factors that are out there, these are the things that cry out for reforms that we have been implementing. We didn't get here overnight. It took 20 years of different kinds of policy gaps to get us here. But the changes that we're making, the reforms at HRA, the reforms at the Department of Homeless Services, for some clients have already taken hold. The 20,000 people that didn't get evicted during this period of time because of increased legal services, prevailing rent arrears, they're benefiting. The 50,000 people that got rental assistance and either didn't go into shelter or came out of shelter with either housing aid or rental assistance, the reforms are working for them. On the other hand, we have 11,000 men, women, children in cluster apartments. This is a 16-year-old program in which the city rented apartments that could have been used for permanent housing that were taken off the market to use for shelters. It was an easy way to site shelters, just rent apartments. You don't have to go through a shelter siting process. On the other hand, at the height of the program, 3,600 apartments were removed from the market that could have been used for low-income housing. And can't end the program overnight, but we've already eliminated, since we announced the reforms earlier this year, 450 of those units, and we're continuing to work to restore units to permanent housing through a whole range of strategies, attempting to convert those units back to permanent housing so the families in them can remain in them. We also have 7,000 men, women, and children in commercial hotels. Once you can no longer put people into clusters, you need a place to put people. Commercial hotels have become a bridge as we develop more shelters, as our prevention programs take hold, and as we phase out the use of clusters. Some of our biggest pieces in the reform effort have not yet even come into play, but are about to come into play. Supportive housing. About a year ago, the mayor made an unprecedented commitment to 15,000 supportive housing units. That's more than in the prior supportive housing agreements. Just earlier this week, we announced the first 550 scatter site units that will come online within the next number of months. That will begin to have an impact. The mayor's affordable housing plan, 200,000 units, either rehabilitated units or new construction units, are beginning to come online and become available to clients who need them. That will have an impact. So in sum, there is a whole range of comprehensive reforms that have already been put in place and more to come. One of the contentious issues that has arisen, some of you know I get visitors periodically at my house, is where to site new shelters. And we're moving to a borough-based approach where we can keep families and individuals close to employment, close to schools, close to medical care. And that's a change, because historically that wasn't always the criteria that was used for sightings. You ended up with the cluster program with 70% of them being located in the Bronx, because that's where the rentals were. I remember when I began as a legal aid lawyer representing homeless people, the problem of having clients from Staten Island being placed in Brooklyn, clients from Brooklyn being placed in Queens, and you get the picture. So the new borough-based approach, and we're going to have more to say about that in the coming period, will lay out a clear roadmap for how we're going to move forward with our continued phase out of the clusters and our continued phase out of the commercial hotels. But someone asked me the other day, how are you feeling about where we're at? And I'll just say this. I was a legal aid lawyer for 33 years, so I'm an optimist by nature. The mayor, I was grateful, asked me to be the HRA commissioner, so I'm an optimist by nature. And the mayor asked me to also run the Department of Homeless Services and to consolidate them, so I'm particularly an optimist by nature. So I welcome your questions.
We have open mics, and the mics are there, and over here, we ask you to line up. But while people are getting there, I'd like to acknowledge the sponsors, the founding sponsors of these programs, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig at this table here. Thank you so much. Con Edison, Consolidated Edison has been a founding sponsor from the beginning, and Verizon, also founding sponsors. I'd also like to acknowledge everybody with a gold star on their label, that they have voluntarily contributed to these breakfasts, and we thank you for that. I'd also like to acknowledge, in addition to Mayor Dinkins, we thank you for being here, former public advocate Betsy Gottbaum. Thank you for coming. Mira Josie, who is the chair of the Taxi and Limousine Commission. I saw her earlier. And Richard Gottfried. I saw him earlier. Where's Richard? He was here earlier. There you are. Thank you, Richard. Okay, we'll start with questions, and let's start on this side. We'll go side to side, and I can see there's a lot of people. Please, short, because we always end at 9:30, and so it's very important that your comments and questions be short enough so everybody gets a chance, and that's the courtesy of the moment.
Want to give the mayor a question?
Well, Mr. Mayor, did you have a question?
Well, I don't have a question.
A comment?
I'm really, a comment. I'm really here in support of this wonderful man who, I know how difficult the job is. And I know that he's a good person, a knowledgeable person. I used to call him my favorite lawyer who sued me.
Yeah. Right.
But I really know how difficult it is. As borough president and mayor, I face these problems, and I know how hard it is. So I was delighted when my friend the mayor put him in charge, because here's a guy who not only is knowledgeable, but he's caring.
Right.
And so I hope that everyone, the media particularly, will. I know how hard it is, but please understand you got a good guy in charge.
Very nice. Thank you, Mayor. It's nice to have a recommendation from somebody you sued. Okay.
Just this is sort of slightly tangential to your borough-based approach. I'm wondering what percentage of the problem involves people who sort of migrate to New York City from other places in the country, and an anecdote or an example of that is the family whose children were, tragically killed by that radiator, and who had just arrived in the city maybe a year before with no job, no relatives, and no prospects, and somehow ended up, being supported perhaps in front of other people because they had small children being supported in the city shelter system?
So I see my good friend Marianne Schretzman's here, who is the master of crunching data. So we do look at this question frequently, and the last time we looked at it was at the end of the fiscal year. We wanted to see how many families with children in the family shelter system were not New York families. And by not New York families, I mean families that didn't have a connection here, they weren't here and left to get work somewhere else and came back. Out of more than 13,000 families in our system, we had about 125, 130 families with children that had no New York connection. So you can see that's not a driver of the problem. On the other hand, how many people here were not born in New York City? Next question. Hi, how are you?
Stephen, I have two comments. A, November 5, 2017 will make the 20th anniversary. I almost got jumped by clients at 3065 Jerome Avenue, which at that time was home to Income Support Center 47, which is a assignment center, which was the pits, over a damn payphone. And regarding my paperwork, you're still getting it. It's possible you're getting it for me within 1 year from today, possibly within 6 months from today. Due to situations beyond my control, I was unable to prepare for you in the last 2 years. Apologize for that, but you're still getting it for me.
Great. It's great to see you. Whenever you can get me the documents, I'm happy to see if I can be helpful to you.
I need your business card.
I think a lot of people know how to find me these days.
Let's go to this side.
Hi, good morning, Commissioner. As one of your service providers, Samaritan Daytop Village, we are happy to be in partnership with you and also recipient of all of the reforms and changes that you're making. I'm happy that we have social workers in our family shelters, again, in large numbers. So that's a big deal for us. I did want to ask you if you could elaborate on any reforms that are, or partnerships with the criminal justice system, if that's an approach or a next step that you are looking to take in your administration.
Well, thank you very much. It's also great to have partners in the service provider community. We couldn't provide the services without service providers. I mean, clearly, criminal justice reforms are resulting in more people who would have spent time in state prison coming back to the city and in our shelter system. And that's clearly one of the challenges. When we announced in April our reforms, just a number of months ago, one of the things we focused on is the desire to really address the increased numbers of criminal justice involved clients coming on parole back to the city into the system. And so we've been working on developing new programs, employment programs. One of the programs that the Doe Fund has is very much focused on employment for parolees, and we're happy to work with any providers on those kinds of programs. They're so important in terms of connecting people back to work once they've come into the shelter system. There are other problems in terms of justice-involved clients that we're very focused on too, which is people that are cycling back and forth between being incarcerated and the shelter system, and we're working with other agencies to really target clients that have the greatest needs that are moving back and forth to get better housing outcomes for them. Again, this is something that we want to work in partnership with providers to identify particular clients. Again, it's not one size fits all, but we want to be very focused.
Could you give some numbers? What kind of numbers?
I mean, there's continual analysis of what the data shows, but it's in the neighborhood of several thousand individuals on parole who are coming into the system at any given time who need help to get back on the feet and back into the community.
My name is Tom Murphy. I'm a member of Community Board 7 in Brooklyn, as you were once upon a time.
I was.
You should put that on your resume.
It was on my resume. For a while, I had to have a special conflicts disclosure that I was on the community board.
I live in Sunset Park, which according to a census that was dropped on us last year is the most overcrowded neighborhood for rental housing in Brooklyn. We trade that title with Borough Park once in a while. But the people who did the census came to our board with a question. With 24,000 families in the shelter system and Sunset Park being number 1 in Brooklyn and number 5 in the city, we only had contributed 46 families to the shelter system. At that time, we had 2 shelters, Turning Point and a domestic violence shelter. We now have maybe 8, 10, 12. DHS will not tell us how many or where they are. And it appears to me on the ground in the neighborhood that the only current policy on the homeless by the mayor is to cram more shelters into Sunset Park.
That's good. That's a question.
I miss the community board meetings. Look, I think to come back to some of the points that I made earlier, this is not a problem that happened overnight. And the use of commercial hotels, many of which are in Sunset Park and other neighborhoods across the city, is a reflection of having to make reforms to a system that has been in need of reform for many years. One of the key issues that I saw when we did the 90-day review was the need for community communications about when we open shelters. We've made one reform with respect to the opening of shelters, which is when it's going to be an ongoing shelter as opposed to renting individual hotel rooms, we now have a very clear notification process.
Stop with the rhetoric.
If I could,
use terms that basically make it easy for you to say nothing to the local community boards.
let me just
We
stop
have
you.
never been informed
Sir,
about the shelters coming in,
sir,
except the first
This
one.
is not a debate. You made a point, and we're getting an answer.
and I'm
Please.
and I'm going to agree with your point, and I appreciate you letting me have an opportunity to finish my comment. So for an ongoing shelter that's going to be in operation, for many years, the city would simply open a shelter in the middle of the night. I see a lot of providers here who participated in that, and I apologize on behalf of my predecessors that you had to. But we've eliminated the problem of when ongoing shelters that we're going to be in for a period of time are opening, we give plenty of notice. The Maspeth situation is a good example. The community was given 60 days worth of notification before we began to use a particular site there. For hotels, which have been used for decades in New York City, there had been no notification process. We've been meeting, engaging with elected officials to develop a better notification process, and we're going to be coming out with that. I acknowledge exactly what you're talking about. I hear your criticism. I don't want to mislead you. There is a notification system for ongoing shelters. We're about to put in place a notification for the rental of hotel rooms. But also I want to emphasize the rental of hotel rooms is a bridge as part of the development of more purpose-built shelters. The city has been in clusters for 16 years renting apartments and is now in hotel rooms because of the need for purpose-built shelters. And we will be coming forward with a siting plan very shortly that'll be very transparent, that'll be very focused on addressing the kinds of needs that I talked about, which is to be able to make sure that people, when they become homeless, can be as close as possible to schools for children, to jobs, to medical care. I acknowledge that the current situation is reflective of problems that have built up over many years, and that causes an issue for you. I do understand that.
On this side. State your name, please.
Hi, Mr. Banks. We've met previously. The first time I met you was on March 1st at the Yale Club, where Chief Judge DeFiore was present, and so was Judge Littman. At that event, I gave you about 5 court transcripts, and you told me you would try to get me some legal help. That never happened. What is your response? What can HRA do for past cases? We've talked about that previously, and it seems like I haven't gotten an answer.
Okay, that's good.
So we've increased funding for legal services tenfold from $6.5 million to $62 million and increased representation in housing court. We refer clients who are being evicted or being harassed to those providers. Someone like yourself that may have a past case is a case in which we can certainly refer anybody to providers. There are a lot of providers that are represented in this room, but ultimately they have to make the judgment about whether there is merit to bring a case. When I ran the Legal Aid Society, and someone in a situation like you would come to us, a lawyer would evaluate your case and see whether or not there was anything that could be done. In terms of a government funder, the change that we've made, the reform that we've made, is we've increased representation in housing court from where it was at 1% to about 27%, and we're continuing to do that. But ultimately, whether a particular tenant has a case or not is a matter of between the lawyer's evaluation of whether there's a case to be brought or not.
Good morning, Commissioner. And you're right, this problem did not occur overnight. To what extent do you think that political figures operating on a state level are contributing to public perception of the homelessness crisis and your performance?
You know, it's a very cold day, and we're very focused on bringing people in off the streets. No, look, I understand your question. One thing I learned when I was at the Legal Aid Society, and it served me well in government, is to focus on the problem in front of us and not dwell on all of the things that go on. At the end of the day, with all of the noise that sometimes happens, whether there are people in one community that don't want a shelter and another community want people to be brought off the street but don't want services to be provided, we're very focused on solutions, because at the end of the day, on any given night, when all the noise goes away, we have the obligation to find shelter for people, because we don't want people to be left on the street without shelter. There's a court order. There's a moral obligation to do so. But as part of reform, we also want to emphasize everybody has responsibilities. Communities have responsibilities. Government has responsibilities, but individual families have responsibilities too. And I think you saw, it's been sort of reported in the Daily News the last couple of days, that we're very focused on trying to make sure that every option is evaluated to make sure that families have another place to stay. They can do that. Motivations, all the other things that are going on are things that are not my focus. My focus is on any night making sure that New Yorkers have a place to stay, making sure that we can address conditions in shelters, making sure that we can bring people in off the streets, making sure that we have programs in place to move people out of shelter, making sure that we have programs in place to prevent homelessness. Those are the kinds of programs which existed in patchwork fashion, if at all, for decades. If those programs had been in place decades ago when we had 24,000 people in the shelter system, we may well not be here today. But we are here today. And the mayor owns the problem. I own the problem on a daily basis as his commissioner. And we are seeing reforms take hold for some clients and new resources that are on their way so the reforms take hold for more clients. And that's what our focus is. The things we can control, we're very focused on trying to control.
We're going to go to this side. We're going to be short on time, so please short, and we'll get as many questions in as we can.
Thank you. Commissioner Banks, thanks very much for your presentation. I also greet Mayor Dinkins. My name is Philip Malbranch, formerly homeless and still struggling to keep from returning to shelter. I'm in the LINK program. I'm a member of the Safety Net Activists, and we appreciate your efforts to meet with us and to consider our points of view. We exist to try to improve the relations with staff people at HRA and the clients, because we encounter often, each time practically, stressful relations with the with the staff people there. And we're trying to ask you to meet with those. I'd like to ask you to say more about the treatment of the clients at HRA and how those might be improved, those encounters.
That's good. That's a question.
Thank you, and I appreciate the work that the Safety Net activist group does. You've been instrumental at giving me input when I first started HRA, and also during the 90-day review, you gave a tremendous amount of input, which I really appreciate. I think that the new employment program reforms that are being rolled out over the course of the coming months will have a very positive impact for the kinds of issues that the safety net activists have been concerned about, which is improving services for clients and addressing client-staff interactions. The technology improvements, I think, will also help there. For example, as you and I know, age-old issues have been, I submitted my document, no, you didn't. I called you, no, you didn't. Those kinds of back and forths. By giving the ability of people to submit documents on smartphones with a record of that submission, by giving people the ability to get their own budget letter, by doing that through the online, there are improvements that will address both client concerns and staff concerns about those interactions, and I think we're going to continue to see progress being made. But your input will continue to be really important to me.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your long dedication to this really complicated issue. I'm wondering, you mentioned the increase in the number of outreach groups that you have in the city. In the 80s, I worked with the Koch administration on the homeless issue and was involved in the Billy Boggs case. And we had a way of empowering citizens then. It wasn't too widespread, but wondering if a similar program exists now where people who are encountering homeless people day in and day out in their back and forth see the same people over and over again. And people had a card with a number for those outreach people so that they could call them and feel as though they're, at least alerting the outreach folks to the fact that there might be a potential client who needs some services. I think it could be a great way to empower the people who, are heartbroken as we see these folks living on the streets. Is there such a program?
Yes, it's actually a great Bloomberg administration innovation, 311. Calls to 311 regarding people that you see on the street are connected to our outreach teams. We doubled the number of outreach workers. There are now nearly 400 outreach workers out there. On a day like today, they're making regular contacts with clients that are on the by name list, particularly the most vulnerable clients. I think one of the concerns that you might have when you call 311 is, but I still see the person. But that just speaks to the fact that it takes repeated, concerted contacts to bring people in. And there continue to be success stories of people that have been on the street for many years that are coming in as a result of the outreach work. But we do encourage people to call 311 just to make sure that we don't miss anybody. We have canvassers out counting and providing information to our outreach teams every day. We have outreach teams out every day. We have a partnership with the police every day, but still observations by New Yorkers are helpful to us.
Good morning, Commissioner. I have a question about borough-based equitable housing. So if one were able to put local politics aside, and I know that's a crazy thought experiment, but we're at a law school, how hard is it to actually identify property from a sort of logistical side in affluent neighborhoods to spread out shelters across the city if, again, politics weren't the issue holding things up?
I think the thing that's important to consider is that we have people in the shelter system from literally every community in the city. And some of what we're very focused on is making sure that we can connect people to their communities that they came from, but also give people the opportunity to be in safe environments if they're fleeing domestic violence. So there's a balance between where people are placed. We live in a city in which real estate costs are high, and so that's a factor in identifying sites for shelters. We live in a city in which so many pieces of property are being used for other purposes, so that puts a constraint on places that we can find. But again, we're moving forward with a new approach, and we'll have more to say about that in the coming days.
Good morning, Commissioner Banks. My name is Blanca Ruiz. I am a working single mother of 2 daughters. I have struggled since 2008 with economic hardship, and I have worked very hard advocating for my family. I also pray not to ever be homeless again, and for an excellent education for my daughters. I pray every night for my family to heal. Thank you, Commissioner Banks, for beginning the much overdue reform of the City of New York's Department of Homeless Services. My question, Banks, is some residents in single adult shelters are parents whose minor children are temporarily living with relatives or caregivers. What can be done to quickly reunite these families with permanent housing?
Thank you very much for your kind words. One of the things that is a tool that didn't exist before is that in those kinds of situations we might be able to use rental assistance to enable people to locate housing with assistance and so that they can be reunited with family. If there are particular cases of that nature, I would encourage you to call 311 and connect them to our agency, and we could try to be helpful.
I'm going to have to apologize to the people standing. This will have to be the last question.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
My name is Roland Nicholson. I'm a former legal aid lawyer from a long, long time ago.
You look familiar to me.
Yeah. One night at a party not far from here, I was attending with a friend of mine, and a person in charge of hotel program at the program was going to a different party in the same building. You left your party and approached him in the lobby, and I said to my girlfriend, says, "That's Steve Banks." He remembered you all the way up. As a past chairman of the Fortune Society, though, I've been following the possible reforms with parole and sentencing in New York, which may come up following the New York Times articles from last week. If that happens, what will your department do to ensure that the increased people coming back to the city from the near Canadian Northland won't wind up homeless? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. We're certainly very interested in working with community groups, with other government agencies, so that shelter doesn't become the default. I mean, that's really what a concern that we have in terms of reforming the system, is that the shelter system has essentially become a repository for every other systemic problem that exists in society. And the reforms that the mayor announced of the shelter system and of the homeless services system just last April are really very much focused on a prevention-first strategy, and that's one of the reasons why we requested the change in the state rule recently. We want to be very focused on a prevention-first strategy, and so we want to work with other partners to make sure that the shelter system doesn't become the solution to every other problem that could be addressed further upstream.
I am sorry, but we're going to have to close at this point. Before we leave the podium, I want to thank the people who put this together, particularly Associate Director Brian Kasuba, Lillian Valle Santiago, Jesse Deno, and Jonathan Sizemore, and the staff of New York Law School. I'd also like to say that our next breakfast will be on February 10th, and Fidel de Valle will be here. He's going to talk about administrative oath, changes at oath in the city. We had a very stimulating morning and an important topic that has been in the news and which so much goodwill travels to you and to the mayor and to the city to work on these issues. So thank you for being here. As we always like to do, we'd like to give a product of the scholarship of the law school, and I present to Commissioner Banks a book by my colleague James Zirin, Supremely Partisan, about the Supreme Court. And in case you become a lawyer again, don't give up. Don't give up your registration. I was going to ask, how many people in the room have litigated either against Steve or with Steve? And quite a few hands. Okay, there they all are. Steve, thank you for a very wonderful morning. We will see you in February.